Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog Series. It is Sunday, October 19th, 2025, and on Sundays we are going to continue to talk about purpose and meaning of life. I've reorganized the Dr. J Vlog Series, as I mentioned in yesterday's vlog, and we're still going to continue on with this especially critical subject matter. And so I'm going to be kind of rehashing a vlog I did in the third week, which seems to have disappeared, but I think it's incredibly important that we look into these issues further. And this has to do with our deep connectedness as human beings with one another. And so in thinking about the purpose and meaning of life, I've talked about the idea previously of creating one's own mission statement, a personal mission statement. And if you haven't done that, I strongly recommend that you take some time to consider creating one for yourself. Something that expresses your sense of self, right? Your sense of your life's purpose. Who you'd like to be, what you'd like to do with whatever years you might be promised. But even if you haven't done that yet, there's a good chance that you probably want to do something positive with your life. Make a difference in some way or another. At the very least, we're all afforded opportunities almost daily to make a difference or to help people through just everyday acts of kindness or what have you. And for example, I was some time back, I was coming out of a convenience store. I noticed a young woman who was trying to help her mother and at the passenger seat of her car. And she was, probably not that much older than myself, but she was, to be fair, rather heavy, obese, if you will, and clearly struggling, and she needed a lot of assistance, okay? But the young woman couldn't manage to actually help get her mother into the seat of the vehicle. She seemed to be almost on the verge of tears. And so I just walked over to help. And, basically I explained to her, I said, hey, I'm happy to try to help here. And then I warned the woman, I said, listen, I'm going to have to grab onto you and squeeze rather tightly. This may hurt a little bit in order to help you get in the car. And I'll never forget her response. She said, oh, don't worry, that couldn't hurt nearly as much as the cancer. Oh, wow. So they were quite thankful, though, to have my little bit of assistance there. And of course, they had bigger issues, obviously, that they were struggling with. And so here's the thing. I'd imagine most of us probably would have done the same thing under similar circumstances, right? If you could provide some help or you have the physical capacity to do so, right? Not everybody does, to be fair, but if you do, why not help? Most of us probably would, almost unthinkingly. We do little things all the time for other people. And sure, some more so than others, but nonetheless, most of us have this tendency, if you will, almost hardwired into us. My wife in particular always blows me away with the number of times that she notices people who need help, and she'll stop and get out of the car or just do any of 100 different things to help out. And it's not that I'm bad at it. I'm pretty good at it too, but it just so happens that my better half is superior in that regard. In fact, here's a true story of what happened, and I told the story previously, but it's funny, and it illustrates quite well some of the differences between my wife and myself. But we live on a ravine that leads down to a river, and so a couple of years ago, I walked out, I was looking out in the back, and I noticed that somebody had built a tent or put up a tent just beyond the fence in our backyard. And it was still on our property because we have the property goes down to the ravine into within, I don't know, 50 feet of the river, something like that. Doesn't matter. But the point is that some rando or some person, maybe a couple of people, I don't know, had, encamped on our property. And we don't really have, we actually don't. We don't have curtains, in the back and the lower house of the main floor of the house, shall we say. And it's just kind of not the strongest defenses or what have you. And so, I don't know who's there and might be a little unsafe. Who knows? But I was trying to decide what to do. And I don't want to, I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to confront anybody or what have you. But I knew that they probably shouldn't, remain on our property, for an extended period of time. So I walked in to the house, and I said to my wife, I said, hey, it seems that somebody's set up tent in the back, in the backwoods there, just maybe 20 feet beyond our fence line there, still on our property, And I was thinking, I was trying to get her advice then about what we should do, how we could remove them from our property, right, politely and so forth, without creating a fuss. And I'm not joking. Her immediate response was, "Oh, do you think we should give them some food? They might be hungry." I was thinking, no, that wasn't the point. You know, no, suddenly we have 1,000 tents on our property. You know, oh, this is a great place to go. I don't know. Anyway, I don't mean to be selfish about it, but nonetheless, right? And then I'm thinking, how do you deal with these situations in real life? So more recently, we encountered another situation where somebody's actually done some work for us. It's not somebody we know particularly well. They're not a friend of ours, but they've done some work for us. Anyway, long story short, they'd been evicted from their housing, along with a couple of their children and so forth. And so they were homeless as of September 1st because they didn't have anywhere immediately to go in the area and so forth. And so, my wife asked if we could take them in for a couple of weeks until they were able to get some new housing. And I said, okay, sure. I've learned, no charge and so on. But then, those couple of weeks turned into the full month of September. And then, no luck, no new housing as of the start of October. And now here we are in the second half of October, and they're still with us. Lovely folks, but, perhaps they'll have a place by the start of November. Who knows? We would like our space back, I guess, at some point, but what can you do? And how many people out there are precariously housed? Or maybe they're, one missed paycheck or one health issue away from being evicted. So it's an unusual situation, but I suspect that most people I've encountered over the years, at least, they may not necessarily bring strangers or, people they don't particularly well into their homes necessarily, but I found that most people are actually quite generous, positive, usually prosocial in their orientations. And that's not merely my opinion, but it's actually what the research shows as well. And that applies cross-culturally. Okay, so for example, Giovanni Rossi and colleagues published a study a couple of years back in Scientific Reports in 2023 titled Shared Cross-Cultural Principles Underlie Human Prosocial Behavior at the Smallest Scale. So I'll include the URL link in the description below, so you can click on that, download your own copy, and have a look for yourselves. But the study found that from towns in England, in Italy, in Poland, and Russia, to the villages of rural Ecuador, Ghana, Laos, and Aboriginal Australia, at the micro scale of our daily interactions, people everywhere tend to help others when needed. It's quite remarkable. Small requests for assistance, for example, even just to pass a utensil, occur on average once every couple of minutes in everyday life around the world. And then the small requests include sharing items for everyday use or assisting others with tasks around their house, around their village, and so on. And these decisions are far more frequent, of course, as you would expect, than high-cost decisions like sharing your paycheck with your neighbor or contributing to the construction of a village road. The frequency of small requests, though, varies by the type of activity that people are engaged in. But these requests for assistance are complied with, on average, 7 times more often than they are declined. So we almost always help when requested, and then 6 times more often than they are ignored. So overall, the average rates of rejection are about 10%, and of ignoring are about 11%, and these are much lower than the average rates of compliance, which is almost 80% in total. Incredible. Even more profound, the preference for compliance is cross-culturally shared and unaffected by whether the interaction is amongst family or non-family members. And the helpful behavior transcends the local norms and the values and even technological differences that might exist as well. So you can do your own mini experiment. Ask a complete stranger, perhaps, if you can borrow their cell phone, for example. Just say that there's some kind of an emergency. You've got to get a hold of somebody. Or because you've lost your cell phone, whatever, okay? Or because you need help to get to work. Make something up. And chances are, in most instances, they're going to say, yes, of course. It's just what we do. And finally, then, when people provide assistance, this is done without an explanation. But when they decline, they normally fashion or they come up with some explicit reason for why they can't help. And they do that 3/4 of the time, in fact. So the norms of rationalization suggest that while people decline giving help, conditionally, like for a reason per se, they give help unconditionally, that is, without needing to explain why they're doing it. They just do, okay? And to be sure, now we all have bad days, right? We might feel overwhelmed and so forth. We might be sick ourselves. We might not be in the mindset to be especially helpful. But even then, sometimes even when we're not at our best, we're able to manage to pick ourselves up and help somebody else. And of course, when we help others, we are invariably also helping ourselves, quite literally. Neurologically, our brains release oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. Psychologically, we usually tick off a mental box that we've done something good. We feel pretty good about that. We feel better about ourselves. And of course, we then reap the social rewards, right? The obvious, the thank yous, the other forms of approval, sometimes quite unexpectedly. Again, if you don't believe me, do your own experiment. The next time you're feeling down or a bit out of sorts, and force yourself to help somebody else, and then see what happens. It's quite remarkable. So why don't we have that type of attitude all the time then? In other words, why do we develop, in fact, ideas about whom we should or shouldn't help, or why people deserve to be helped or not helped? And that's where things, of course, get a bit more complicated. Because if someone enters our immediate awareness and our sphere of influence, then that's going to shape our responses. If someone in need, especially in an emergency situation, this usually almost always activates our empathetic side, and we intervene. I'm not suggesting we'd all be willing to necessarily, run into the burning house to save someone, but there's all kinds of low-cost behaviors that we'll typically engage in, even in helping total strangers. Quite commonplace. We can often directly see the cause and effect of our efforts, and that seems to emerge from a common place deep within ourselves. And perhaps just as important, if we act in an emergent situation, or if we're acting immediately in response to someone in need, what have we not typically done? We haven't done the mental calculus. We haven't activated the cognitions associated with our evaluative judgments, our ideological constructions about our own kind or our own tribe, and so on. Right? And so the further we remove ourselves from the immediacy of the human experience, such as the experience of real human suffering amongst people, right, or even animals for that matter, then the more tribal and usually the more selfish we tend to become, right? So kind of in the abstract, right? So in fact, because we're humans, we then have this capacity to create all kinds of narratives and rationalizations of who deserves what and why, okay? And there's been a long-standing political discourse, for that matter, about the so-called deserving versus undeserving poor. But politics is just about the lowest, form of discourse, if you will, in the sense that it's rooted in, often rooted in people's prejudices and ideological divisions and so on. But there's a deeper point I simply want to make, that in that moment of helping someone else, do you ever stop to think or to ask them who they voted for in the last election, or what political party they belong to, right? And when the Pacific fires burned last year, in terms of at the Pacific Palisades or other neighborhoods and so on, and you've lost your home, or you've lost everything, or especially even worse, if you've lost a family member, whatever, do the politics really matter at all at that point, right? If you're on the ground in a disaster, nearly everyone to a person is just focused on trying to intervene as effectively and help as best they can. Most of us just rally together. And we all know that deep in our bones. That's how we would respond. We're wired to be connected with each other. And so that's my main message then today. The ultimate purpose and meaning of life, I think, stem from our deep connectedness with each other. We have this transcendental capacity, if you will, that emanates through the material selves, our biological and our psychological and our sociocultural dimensions of our selves at all of these different levels. And that capacity then tends to be reinforced through the core messages of the major religions, which usually aim for some higher purpose and deeper meaning in our lives. That's religion at its best, and it sort of accords with these deeply rooted principles of human assistance and support and altruism and empathy and connectedness. So we may not always be able to realize those connections, right? Because we might be struggling ourselves. We might be struggling with health and our well-being at times. We might be struggling with our own mental health issues, or because we've been conditioned, perhaps, by, in some cases, by these poisonous or hateful ideologies, right? But, in some cases, we've constructed, a reality where we're essentially fighting against ourselves and the better angels of our nature. But for most, we've usually constructed some kind of a reality where we look out into the world, okay, and then we have to make decisions about how to respond. And if we look hard enough, we can usually find that there's some reason to transcend our individual selfishness and even at times our tribes, okay? Because if we're not careful, we'll often, again, at least in the abstract, tend to characterize the other tribes as somehow not equally worthy. And then we disconnect and we become disconnected. They in turn become disconnected from us and we become alienated from each other. And that's sort of the worst case scenario, right? So I'm by no means the most well-traveled person in the world, but I've been to about 20 different countries in my lifetime, countless cities and communities, of course, across the US and Canada as well. And what happens when you have the chance then to be invited into somebody else's home? Well, again, this is just my experience, obviously, but I've noticed that two things happen with consistency every time when I'm invited in as a guest. First, there's a smile and there's some kind of a greeting, some kind of an exchange, a welcoming, right? That's the first thing. And then the second thing, whatever else happens in the context of that interaction, or me being invited into their homes, they'll share food. Like if there's a meal involved, or even if it's just a tea or whatever, they'll always share food, and usually, quite often, their very best food or a special dish or what have you. And that has always been the case, without exception. Right? So the problem then isn't that we don't universally try to help each other or share our best food when we invite someone into our homes. The problem is that there's some people who are maybe camped out on our property, right? Uninvited, living in a tent in our backyard or the backwoods, and some of us think, hey, you need to get off of my property. But then we're reminded by somebody like my better half that, hey, maybe they're hungry and they just need some food. Or like Paul McCartney when Jesus, this is the story that he tells, showed up at his door. And he said, oh, well, come on in. And he thought, he didn't know if he was Jesus or not, but he'd be better off not taking any chances, but just extending some warmth and courtesy and having him, come into his home or what have you. Anyway, we can all do that at times, but as I say, it's a fascinating world that we live in. But I do get the sense that most of us, most of the time, want to find some way to connect and to help others rather than dump on them or, make their lives more miserable. So we do what we can do, right? All right, as ever, until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. We'll see you soon.